morning, everyone, and thank you ever so much for tuning in again to the JLX Friends of Benefits podcast. And a big thank you again to Jack for joining us. It's always a pleasure to have you. For those of you tuning in on YouTube, you'll see that we haven't got the video up today, and that's because we had some technical issues. But instead of missing out, we thought we would dive in with the audio. So those of you listening on podcast app like Spotify and so on, you guys won't have missed out one bit. So let's dive in. Today, Jack, obviously we're going to come to you first and see if you've been up to anything that you are excited about or have been up to this past week. But then we're going to dive into our 3 essential hamstring exercises, and keeping in with the rules of what the game's been so far, they have to be 3 exercises, and they're only 3 exercises that you can do for an entire year. You can't train them out. Obviously you would normally, but this is part of our little game. And we'll do them in order of importance as well. But before we get to that, Jack, do you want to kick us off with anything you're excited about this week? And we'll go from there.
Yeah, mate, I've got a very important one this week because I've heard it was someone's birthday yesterday.
No, you little bastard.
I'm very excited that he actually celebrated it this year. So tell us a little bit about that, mate.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, so thanks, mate. I don't know. Birthdays have always been a funny one for me. I think your message probably yesterday topped that off. I kept it quiet. I don't know why it is. It's just something that I think I've struggled with for some reason. I don't know whether it's because I don't want the fuss or I don't know. I really don't. It's probably something I should figure out, but I thought, screw it. Do you know what? This year I actually had loads of fun. I really let myself go. And I just thought, actually, do you know what? Maybe I'll post a little story just to celebrate my own birthday. And it was actually, I got some really nice messages. It was very nice to have everyone in. So everyone who messaged in, thank you ever so much. And for those of you who didn't, don't worry about it, because it's not something I tend to broadcast. But yeah, it was lovely. And it's not the case that I put it up for people to be like, hey, happy birthday. It was more the case for me to be like, I'm going to celebrate my birthday this year. I'm going to be a bit more, I don't know, vulnerable, I guess, with it and see what happens. But it's never the case that I thought people would be like, fuck you, it's your birthday. Do you know what I mean? It was just I don't know, but yeah, no, it was nice, and we had a great time. We actually went to Top Golf at the weekend, which was really good fun. This is basically a driving range with holes in the floor, so you can win points and stuff. That was pretty decent, and met up with some good friends and so on. So yeah, I was very spoiled, had a great time, and yeah, it was a lovely birthday. So thank you, Jack, for broadcasting that to the people.
Mate, question 1: Is there a Top Golf in Exeter?
No, we had to go to Watford. Not Watford. There is one in Watford. We went to one in Surrey though.
Hell of a drive for a bit of golf.
Yeah, we were based in Portsmouth, so it was only like an hour and 10 minutes.
Okay.
But it was well worth it, and it was something like we'd always wanted to do. There was a few of us who really wanted to go. So
yeah.
By the way, if anyone's thinking of it, it's really COVID safe there. They did a really, really good job. It was obviously there's a big concern about that at the moment, but it was fantastic. We're people who take it very, very seriously, and yeah, we felt very safe there. It was good fun.
And secondly, mate, I'm sure that when I did that this morning, it reminded me of, I'm sure I put you in it on your birthday with someone else last year.
Yeah, Lauren.
Who was it?
Hasham.
Oh, was it?
Yeah.
Oh, shout out Lauren.
It was on our team coaching chat, and you were like, happy birthday, and she was like, oh shit, happy birthday. I was like, thanks, mate, appreciate that.
I think it's because, do you know what? I've been the same in the past. I've been like, I went through a few years of being like, I don't really care about it. I'm not really going to celebrate it. And it wasn't until I actually embraced it a bit more and not forced myself to celebrate it, but figured out that it is what you make it. And if you want to have a bit of fun with it, enjoy it, and just enjoy it for what it is, then you can, rather than just it always being something that you're like quite closed off to. So I think I'm keen to like push people to do the same as well if they're not celebrators of like birthdays or Christmas and stuff like that. I think it's a nice opportunity, especially if you work hard, if you work a lot. It's a nice opportunity to have a bit of time just getting your head out of it completely and switching things up.
Yeah, do you know, you've hit the nail on the head for me there with what you said about not celebrating it. I just thought I can't be bothered. I don't like it. I guess in a way, it's probably if you wanted to look into it, it's probably a way of just being like, I don't really care about it because of X, Y, and Z. Whatever those reasons are, there's probably reasons behind that. And I never
Mm.
wanted to throw myself into it. I don't know why that is, but for some reason, it's more a case of that kind of, oh, if I think I don't care, I won't care if nothing happens or something. But like this year, and it actually was a picture that you posted last year that made me think about it, because you put up a little post on Instagram with you with a banner, and I'd never seen that before. And that kind of encouraged me to be like, do you know what? Fuck it, I'll push the boat out and I'll post a little. It wasn't a picture of me; it was just like a little picture of my lounge. But I just thought, yeah, maybe I'll embrace this and see what happens. And it was actually loads of fun. So kind of like I I milked it real hard on Friday. I was like, "This is birthday day one." And Kate was like, "You can't have 5 days of birthdays." I was like, "Motherfucker, I'm making up for time."
What about you, man? What have you? Is that what you've been excited about? Is that going to be your thing as well?
Yeah, I guess so.
Done two in one.
Yeah, two birds in one stone. So yeah, no, it was a great time, and yeah, thank you for dropping me in there. So, did you actually have anything you were excited about around that, or is that going to be your one for the week?
Mate, that was it. Straight up. That's what I'm claiming this week.
Brilliant, 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 brilliant. Right, mate. Let's dive in then. So, three exercises in the usual fashion. Hamstrings are the muscles. What are we going for first?
Number one is going to actually be just a straight hamstring curl, machine hamstring curl. And people might be surprised that I've put that before, perhaps another one that a lot of people will be thinking about. But I think if you're going purely hamstring isolation, then the main function of that hamstring is going to be to close that angle at the knee, do the opposite of what we were doing for a leg extension, essentially. If you haven't listened to our exercises for quads, go back and listen to that one. And I think I would say a lot of the same things about the hamstring curl as I did the leg extension, in the sense that form becomes really important with it, making sure that you're really locking yourself into place and just making sure that it's the only the hamstring that's doing the work, only the knee joint that's moving. I think it's important to emphasize that, like with the leg extension as well, because a lot of people do tend to, I would say, kind of half-ass them quite a lot,
Mm-hmm.
sometimes due to form, sometimes due to RIR and effort. But when done properly, when really executed hard, they can absolutely kill your hamstrings in a very direct way.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I would go personally. I wouldn't go hamstring curl first, but I can see why you have. And I think comparing the hamstring curl with the leg extension, I think the hamstring curl has a much bigger impact to grow the hamstrings than the leg extension has to grow the quads.
Yes,
So
I agree.
it's probably worth mentioning for those of you who don't know, and this is quite a cool fact, but the hamstrings are what are known as a biarticulating muscle or biarticular muscle, and that basically means that they cross the muscle crosses two joints. So not only will it flex the knee, as Jack said, closing the angle at the knee, but it'll also it'll also extend the hip, which is why you get, say, a good morning or an RDL, but you also get hamstring curl, and both of them work. So it's quite a cool muscle in that respect. Um, I I'm not fully against that being like the biggest hard hitter, but my personal preference, if I had to choose, would probably be between a good morning and a stiff-legged deadlift for my two favorites. But again, this isn't necessarily because it's right or wrong. It's just that that would be my preference. Because as I said, I think that the hamstring curl has a much bigger effect to grow the hamstring than the leg extension has to grow the quads. I think just for me, I'm a big fan of compound movements. So
Mm-hmm.
I see the hamstring curl as really essential. So it's not something I would drop out. If someone said to me they wanted to grow their hamstring, I wouldn't be like, should I give a hamstring curl or not? It's a definite. It's an absolute definite. And I think as well, the cool thing about hamstring curl versus something like a stiff-legged deadlift or a good morning is that the skill level required is a lot less, and the ability to take it close to failure much easier. So in that respect, the hamstring curl I think can be a really fantastic asset, because people, I mean, like you said, some people do them half-assed, absolutely. And if, not to blow smoke up your ass, Jack, but if you want to see someone do hamstring curls like an absolute madman, check out Jack's hamstring curl. I remember when we trained together and I was thinking, that must be about RL2. No. Honestly, you've got a really good ability to just ignore that pain barrier, I think, in that regard, especially. And your hamstrings speak for themselves. So, in that respect, I think, yeah, absolutely. But I think in a beginner sense, then yeah, I probably would say that the hamstring curl is well up there. I think as it gets more advanced, it still is well up there. I just think potentially you could get some good action from a compound, but that's just my preference, as I said. Any thoughts on that?
I think you would get significantly more activation from something like if we were saying a kind of number one exercise, comparing the two. Do you not think you get a lot more activation out of something like a really good heavy hamstring curl because of just how direct it is compared to having just say like an RDL in there?
Yeah, so if I was going to compare, I'd probably go like Good Morning. That would be like my best. And I agree that you would get more activation out of a hamstring curl. I think the reason I would go with a Good Morning first is purely because the ability to progressively overload that movement over time is much higher. Because a lot of people's skill level for it is very low. So you'll get a really good stretch as you start just using the barbell, for example. And I remember when I hadn't done any for ages and ages and ages, and I just used the barbell, I had terrible DOMs for days, because you get a really good stretch component out of it. And then, you can work all the way up into the hundreds if you're strong enough to do so, with that. And I find that in itself over time, if we're talking about doing this over a year, I think could be potentially a bigger grower. I have no evidence to suggest that is true. I just using my own logic on that.
I think this is probably the one that we've disagreed with most in all of our little series so far.
Yeah, interesting.
Because I think for me, Good Mornings, I agree that they can cause a lot of soreness. I agree that there's a good ability to overload that and take that further. But with a Good Morning, not that activation's everything. I'm not someone who purely looks at like EMG data and says, right, this has got more EMG than that, and so it must be a better exercise. Of course, that's not the only factor. But you talk about really progressing a Good Morning. And I would argue that as you progress that, a good amount of what else comes into it is things like lower back strength and overall core strength. You do shift a lot of the weight around to your hips as well, and glutes get involved. It's not just purely like every 10 kilogram jump up you take in Good Mornings is overloading your hamstrings directly more and more and more and more. And in fact, a lot of people will probably find, as I do, that I can end up fatiguing my lower back a lot sooner than I fatigue my hamstrings with a Good Morning. Whereas with something like a ham curl, I can really dial into it and purely get my hamstrings only to failure. And you talk about not really having as much scope to progress it, but I mean, I've been training hamstrings hard for years and years and years, and I still don't stack out every hamstring machine that I use. I feel like I've still got a lot of scope for progression on those because it's such a difficult movement to use huge amounts of weights on, because it's such a small, concentrated isolation movement, that I feel you do still have a good amount of scope with it, unless your gym has unusually small machines that have very light weight stacks.
Or you have abnormally large hamstrings. Yeah, I get that. I think it's a difficult one, really, because I guess the point we're arguing here is knee flexion versus hip extension. Because, as I said at the start, they're both very, very important for what we're discussing here. And it would almost be interesting to see a study done on if you just did knee flexion, what would be the growth? And if you just did hip extension, what would be the growth? But I actually think that the argument almost comes down to the fact that you need both. I don't think it is like one or the other that you need. And for those of you who are listening, that's not the discussion we're having. It's not that you shouldn't do one or the other. It's that which do we think is the hardest hitting one? I think that the thing you miss out on the hamstring curl is a stretch component. So full range
Yeah.
of motion, yes, but there's no necessarily loaded stretch on a hamstring, so you miss out on that. But then you could also argue that, you know, there's huge trade-offs against both of them here, because as you say, okay, well, I don't get the massive stretch component, but on a seat I also don't get any lat engagement or upper back or lower back or glute. I get literally just hamstring.
Well, and also on the good morning, you don't get any full flexion component. You know, if we're saying you don't get any full stretch on the hamstring curl, you also don't get full flexion, and as in full closing of the knee angle when you're doing the good morning.
Yeah, well, this is it, isn't it? I think that the hamstring obviously wouldn't be at full flexion in that motion, and that's the thing, isn't it? And that's why these two, I think, pair up really nicely, because you don't get full range of motion or full stretch component in one, and you don't get full contraction in the other. Therefore, if you put them both together, you get the full range out of the whole hamstring. Yeah, interesting. I think that compound movement wise, you know, I think that in the hamstrings, if I think of, I've just been thinking while you were talking then, I was just thinking of any other muscles I would compare them to. And there's actually not any I would really compare to. There's not any I can think of, and hopefully maybe you can, but I can't think of any other muscle group where I would even think about potentially trading out something like a compound or even like a secondary compound for an isolation like this. I think the hamstrings are probably one of the only muscles I can think of, unless there's something blatantly obvious that I'm not thinking of, that I would trade out.
I'd say like rear delts, but I guess that's a component of a muscle. That's almost like saying the bicep femoris for the hamstring. You know, it's kind of
Yeah.
one of the parts of a bigger muscle. So yeah, I think especially for such a large muscle group, definitely.
Yeah, interesting. That's pretty cool, actually, because I was just thinking, like, I wouldn't trade out like a pull-up for like a single arm cable pull down, or I wouldn't trade out like a bench press of dumbbells or a barbell for a cable fly. That's quite cool. But yeah, I think it's good that we have, you know, these, you know, for anyone who maybe hasn't listened to in fact, while we're here, one of the things I find is a really good way to learn is listening to two people debate things out, because I love listening to scientific debates, not like super nerdy ones, but like I love listening to like two people go at it on two exercises or two methods of training, because you end up getting both sides of their debate. And as long as you don't carry a bias to either person or either particular argument, you actually get all the points put down on the table for you. And then you can kind of sit in the middle and be like the judge of like, I don't kind of agree with that one, and I do kind of agree with that. And then you can come up with what's best for you. And that's the coolest thing about these kinds of conversations, you know. In a way, it's almost not helpful when we agree on everything, because people don't get both sides of the story.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think this is really cool. I'm actually secretly very happy that we've disagreed on that one. That's cool.
And I think the biggest thing that we'll definitely both agree on is that the next exercise for me would be some sort of straight leg deadlift variation. And I would imagine for you, Xander, would be a hamstring curl.
How did you know?
So the big takeaway is having to use both, because as Xander said, it's a biarticulate muscle, simply meaning that it crosses the hip joint and the knee joint. You have to make sure that if you're going to optimally engage it and work it in order to grow, you have to be doing both of those types of exercises spread throughout the week, especially if you're someone who wants to like really focus in on hamstrings and really grow them. Having a good mix of both of those things is vital.
I have an interesting question for you. So on your hamstring curl, just because I'm on hamstring curl now, obviously, what's the rep range you'd most, maybe you personally most enjoy?
Personally, I enjoy going heavy with them, but I do have both a heavy and light
Yeah.
in my plan, and I'm happy to program heavy and light for people. Especially if I could only choose one, it would of course just be in that like 6 to 8, maybe 10 kind of rep range, the general kind of quote unquote muscle gain rep range. But if I have the option to program in multiple across the week, then I really like having both lower and higher, because I think it's a very versatile exercise where you can do that.
Yeah, no, I agree. I'm not a big fan of the heavier ones, but I think I mentioned earlier how much I know you love those. I this is the thing. So the way I would program, if I was going to do 2 exercises in the same session, I would do my good mornings of like 6 to 10, or my stiff-legged deadlifts from like 6 to 10, because after that, the lower back really does start to take a pounding. And I'd say I have a really quite strong lower back. And that's mainly because I work on my glutes quite a lot. So, naturally they do their job properly. And then I would use my hamstring curl from like the 10 upwards. I do like an 8, but I think the fact that I have a history with knees, it can leave me really quite sore the next day. And I'm not talking muscular, I'm talking like actually my knee hurts. So for me personally, I would always use the hip hinge for my heavier stuff, because that doesn't seem to bother my knee at all. And I feel like I get good engagement from the hamstrings. And yeah, you're right, there is some glute there as well. And then I can use that kind of 10 to 15 rep range to just really burn them out at the end. And I find that really nice way to do it. So how would you then, if you were to do both in the same session, how would you program those together?
So I would ideally think of this in terms of a training week or a microcycle. So if you're looking across your couple of sessions and you're really trying to emphasize hamstrings, I'd look to start something off with, say, one of those sessions, like you've said, a really heavy straight leg deadlift variation. That could be an RDL, that could be a good morning, that could be a full straight leg deadlift from the floor. And then later in that session, go and do some lighter hamstring work towards the 12 rep plus hamstring curls. In that other session then, later in the week, maybe you're talking, 3 to 5 days later, I would then start off with a heavier hamstring curl, really get to smash it in that 6 to 8 rep range, and then get a chance to have those higher rep range straight leg deadlift variations later in a session. That could be a bench supported unilateral dumbbell RDL. That's a mouthful. It could be
So that 5 times quicker.
just a straight dumbbell RDL. Or again, could just be a barbell RDL, but higher rep. And that allows you to cover all of those movements in the different rep ranges across that week. One thing I will underscore as well for when I do heavy hamstring work, and generally every single time when I program it for someone else as well, is I make sure there's a good tempo element of that. Because I think just blindly smashing out 6 rep hamstring curls is probably not going to be too effective for a lot of people. You're going to find that you probably get to a sort of weight where it's slamming on the way back up and you're not really able to control it. And then you're really struggling on the way back down, and maybe your back's coming out of place in the seat and stuff. So when I say, 6 reps, that may seem really, really low for some people, but I'm talking having a 3 to 4 second eccentric. So as your knee angle is opening back up again, and then an explosive rep back down as you contract the hamstrings, and then a good 1 second pause at the bottom to really squeeze the hamstrings when that knee angle is closed. So that may only be equivalent to the sort of weight that you could actually use for maybe 8 to 10 reps, say, or maybe even slightly more, because you've added that tempo component. And especially at first, if you've not done that before, that's going to feel really, really difficult compared to just going with no regard for tempo. But once you get them down and you get used to that sort of tempo, you will start to find it a lot easier with time and be able to progress that on. But it just means that you're genuinely, truly engaging the hamstrings and flexing them hard, rather than just going through the motion and the movement, again, as we've spoken about with doing leg extensions poorly versus properly.
You've touched on something there which I think is really worth us diving into a little bit before we go into the last one. And that is tempo. And the reason I say that's important is because actually I think the hamstrings have the, for want of a better word, the biggest soreness component to them. I don't know about you, but there's only a couple of muscles I think that I can be really sore from for like days. And one of them is the hamstrings.
Yeah.
Is that the same for you?
Yeah, same.
And I'm sure it's probably the same for a lot of you guys listening in, and you're probably thinking like, why on earth is my hamstrings the worst? And there's a couple of things, and Jack, I'm going to come to you just after this because I think that there'll be some really great things you can add to this. The first one for me is the stretch component you can get. So we know that muscle damage is caused a lot through eccentric loading, probably more than concentric, although concentric obviously still does cause muscle damage. You can also get a really good stretch component out of the muscle. So you get a much bigger damage, basically, caused by the larger ranges of motion. So if you think about that, and you might be thinking, well, hang on a minute, I use 4 range of motion every other exercise. Think about the amount of stretch you get in your shoulders when you do lateral raises, like none. When you do, probably the only other muscle I get a really good stretch out of actually is the lats, doing things like pull-ups and pull-downs, and doing, really letting the shoulders go at the bottom. So I get a really good stretch, leaning back a little bit just to put an extra bit of stretch on it. But that's probably the only muscle I can think of that, for example, the quads, unless you have absolutely superb range of motion and you can basically sit on the backs of your ankles, it's very unlikely you're going to get maximal stretch out of the quads. In fact, when I do Bulgarian split squats, I get more of a stretch out of my back leg than I get out of the front one. And so you get basically, and this is where tempo ties into this. If you use those tempos really wisely, you can really emphasize that and you can get so much more out of it. Which is why, as you just said then, Jack, it's not about doing 6 reps with the most manic weight you can. It's about taking a weight that you could probably do 8 to 10 mediumly good reps with and making them perfect, but for 6. And that pain will be unbelievable. The burn will be insane, the engagement will be insane, but you won't get that kind of inner knee tendon pain that you might get if you just sling kind of 6 reps up as fast as you like. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. The stretch component is definitely the biggest thing with it when you're in that RDL type position with straight legs. And I think it's also the fact that it's a huge muscle as well.
Yeah.
Even if you don't necessarily have thick, very large hamstrings, just from a cross-sectional area compared to other muscles across your body, it takes up half of your leg essentially on that back side, that posterior side of your body. And so you've got a large amount of muscle fibers there to tear, to break down, and to feel sore with the next day.
Yeah, massively. The other thing I think about the old hamstrings is that the angles that you can work them in and the amount of torque you can gauge is huge. So I don't know what sort of hamstring curl machine you've got, but you'll probably remember the one that we have. It's like a one that a pad comes down onto your lap and you can like lock it into place. And then the pad that you're working sits behind the feet like most do. But that one that like pushes down onto your quads means that if you push that down really, really tight, you can really isolate the quads. And do you remember last week, the hamstring story? Do you remember last week when we were talking about the quads? We spoke about people who kind of pop up out of the chair just to get that extra bit of weight, and you kind of lose the isolation factor. This machine that we have is just unbelievably good because it just basically bolts you into the chair. So then when you're pulling the heels back into the bum, like you don't get any movement out of the hips. And if you do, you're like about to snap your femur. So you probably won't. And
well, I think
the
equivalent with those, and for laying hamstring curls as well, the equivalent of that, so seated and laying, is people move their torso instead.
Yeah, that's true.
What you might see is people's lower back shooting away from the seated pad and the back pad as they kind of push down with the hamstrings, almost to bring their stomach up and make like more of a straight line from their hips to their shoulders. Because when your hips are fully flexed and you're sat back in that position, as if you're kind of parallel from your upper legs to your torso, it's more difficult. And it's supposed to be, that's a good thing because it puts all of that stress on your hamstrings. But yeah, you see people moving the torso position to try and get a little bit of extra leverage. Or if they're on a laying curl, they try to shift the hips kind of upwards. You see that quite a lot. People's glutes kind of raising up off of the pad. So yeah, still make sure that even if you are fixed in place, you are still keeping your body still as well and not trying to find any which way possible to get out of the pain.
Here's a little nugget of information. Do you know who Jordan Peterson is? The absolute monster bodybuilder.
I was thinking of the guy who does like public speaking and is an author.
No, not. Oh yeah, he's called. Yes, now I know who that is. No, that's not who. No, no. So there's a guy called Jordan Peterson, and some of you who are really into bodybuilding might have seen it. The guy's an absolute monster, and he did a video on YouTube, on Instagram the other day that said, "I've done hamstring curls wrong for like 15 years or something," and I was like, "This is blatantly clickbait," but I'm going to click it anyway. And
Mate, I
and
just want to interject quickly. I've Googled it. It's Jordan Peters.
oh, Peters.
Peterson is the author. So don't go getting your workout tips from an author and public speaker.
Although most people, actually, I'm not going to say that. It doesn't matter. Yeah, Jordan Peters. That's it. What does Jordan Peterson? What book does he do, by the way?
It was like 12 Rules for
Yes.
Life or
Yeah,
something.
I read that recently. That's why that his name's in my. I thought it was as soon as you said that. Yeah. So Jordan Peters. So the guy's an absolute monster, and he did this thing which was like, I've done hamstring curls wrong for 15 years or something, and I was like, okay, like I'll have a look at this. And he was saying that he now pushes. So he used to push himself into the chair. And now he started to use the handles to pull himself away from the chair and sit the hips back into the corner. And I kind of thought about this for a while, and I thought, I don't really understand how this works, because from a talk perspective, you want to get as much grip as possible. Anyway, I lowered the weight down and I tried it, and I got really good engagement. I actually thought, there's maybe something in this, and I'm yet to actually iron this theory out for myself and see if it's something I really do want to do, because I don't know if it is more effective, but it was certainly quite interesting to try the complete opposite, because I think he was saying in the comments section, when somebody asked him, they were like, look, when it gets heavy, you're really prone to coming out of the chair. But if you
Mm-hmm.
start out of the chair and you fix yourself in that position, due to the angle of the hip, so because you're leaning forward, you've closed the angle of the hip some more, which means you're going to get more of a stretch out of the hamstrings anyway. And he said something like, if you're already in that position, then when it gets heavy, you don't get pulled out of position because you're already in the position you would get pulled into. I just thought it was quite interesting. Kind of a bit of a nuanced view on the whole exercise, but I thought might be worth a try, and it was quite good.
Yeah. I guess to conceptualize that for people at home, if you can imagine you are pulling yourself using the pad that normally touches your quads, you're pulling yourself forward. So your back and your torso is further forwards, and there's a smaller angle between your torso and your upper legs.
Yeah,
By doing so, what I would think that's allowing him to do is take out some of the engagement from the hamstring muscles that do cross over the hip joint at the top. You're kind of deactivating those a little bit and making sure that you are purely working on those muscles that are contracting the hamstrings by flexing the knee. You're getting less help from the hips essentially. And of course, forcing yourself to stay in that position and not come out of it as well. Another thing that's a bit like that is sometimes you'll see people pointing their toes as they're doing hamstring curls instead of pulling their toes back towards their shins. And you'll find that if you do point your toes forward, it's actually more difficult. And that's because you don't have the help and the engagement of your calves in that scenario. Personally, I don't like it. I don't like doing it like that. I would rather actually pull my toes back towards my shins and shift more weight, quite frankly. And it always feels a little bit loose for me when I've got my feet pointed forwards. But if you have a little play around with things like torso position, things like your ankle angle, so where your toes are positioned as well, you will start to feel that there are different things that do directly impact the hamstrings, just because you're changing things either further up or further down that posterior chain.
ideal. I think that's a perfect note there to move on to exercise number 3. What have you got in the tank?
Number 3. So I think we said with hamstrings, we brought it down to 3 because there are so few compared to something like the glutes or the quads that you can really do. And so I think as long as you've got those first 2 and you have variations of those first 2, generally you're all good, especially if you're working them multiple times across the week. You're hitting those different rep ranges, you're cycling in and out different ones throughout your training year. So a third one I think could be relatively optional at people's discretion. I actually quite enjoy a rowing machine hamstring curl. So for this one, you would be laying at the end of a rowing machine, back on the floor. Your heels are up on what would be the seat of the rowing machine. You kind of push your body as far in as you can, so your upper leg is right in by the rowing machine itself where it starts, and then you can get a big stretch out at the top, and then you kind of curl in using your hamstrings. You pull that seat back towards you, and really importantly, as you do so, you shift the hips upwards, almost like you're doing a hip extension at the same time. And it really hits the hamstrings hard, especially if you can I add like a dumbbell on the seat for weight. And if you're really sadistic, something I do is hang half the dumbbell off of the seat onto the actual rail that the seat slides on. So it gives you a huge amount of friction as you're pulling back with the hamstrings across that machine. And it's the sort of exercise where for the first few, you'll be like, this is child's play.
Mm-hmm.
This is fine. And after about 10, 12, 15 reps, you're going to be struggling to even move those hamstrings anymore. And especially if you do it with short rest going on to second sets, third sets, fourth sets, it gets really, really painful. And it's a great way to work the hamstrings, yes, with a curl, but in a different sort of way where you can get full extension at the hips and at the knees with that big stretch at the bottom, and then really driving the hips up and pulling with the hamstrings for the top. You also get a good bit of glute activation as well. And I find that it's something that doesn't really take a lot of mental effort also. So we were talking, I think when we were talking about quads, we were saying about how we wouldn't want to go and do like squats and then go right into some really heavy leg press or something, and how like the mental load is big as well in that sort of scenario. You're just fatigued by that point. It's one of those nice exercises that even if you've done a ton of big other leg exercises in that session, because it's so unloaded compared to all of the other exercises you're doing, you don't have to go and chuck a heavy barbell on your back or hold some really heavy dumbbells in your hands or something. I find it's really nice to do it at the end of a workout as a finishing exercise for the hams.
Yeah, I also like. I think there's three variations of that exercise I really like. So the first one, as you've mentioned, is the rowing machine hamstring curl. The second one I really like is the Swiss ball. Now the Swiss ball has a difficulty, and that's that the Swiss ball is a Swiss ball. So the damn thing rolls around the place a fair bit. But if you can nail that exercise, it's actually horrible. And so is a TRX hamstring curl as well. I think they're three that I would categorize in that same, like, really good for higher rep burning based exercises. And I actually like all three of them, to be honest. I probably dislike the hamstring curl on a Swiss ball the most. Not personally, but I find that a lot of clients tend to have balance issues. And if balance is the issue, then we're missing the point here, because most people are looking to grow the muscle, not join the circus. So hitting that muscle hard is our priority, not trying to balance around the place. I think we discussed that actually in things like Bulgarian split squats, didn't we, last episode?
Mm-hmm. One more variation on that as well which is really, really easy if you guys don't have a rowing machine that you can do that with at the gym. You can literally just have any hard floor and then anything that slips under your feet.
Yeah.
That could be an old t-shirt, that could be a tea towel. You can buy dedicated like floor slider things if you search them on eBay or Amazon. We use that a lot with clients when they were doing at-home training plans. Get something that slides on a hard floor and you're good to go. And if you find that too easy, start doing them one-legged and it'll be really difficult really quick.
Yeah. It's actually much harder as well because, as you touched on briefly, you're also relying on hip extension as well. And as we discussed at the start, with your hamstrings being biarticular, they also help with hip extension. So not only do the glutes work to extend the hip, but your hamstrings will be working to do that, and they'll be working to flex the knee. So you get this kind of double whammy, which is pretty intense. And that actually feeds into mine. So I think that I would probably use one of those three, but just in the art of giving a different answer for this third one, because I think this is where we have room for play, right? This is probably the one where we have a bit more room for variation. And whilst I agree with yours, I'm just going to, play devil's advocate and say something different. I also like a 45-degree hamstring focused hyper, because they're a really easy exercise to get a bit of knee extension, a bit of hip extension, a bit of knee flexion, a bit of hip extension. But also you can do them really heavy if you want to go on like a GHR like we did. Or you can do them lighter on the 45 and do like 25 to 30 reps. You can grab a plate, do 10 to 15. So it's quite a versatile action, and I find it's quite friendly. So
Hey, you've glazed over some terms there in terms of the equipment that you use for it. Could you just explain that for people? Because I'm aware you said it quick, and some people might be going, what, and what?
yeah, fair enough. So actually, now I mention this, I think we discussed the 45-degree hyper. So a 45-degree hyper is basically a machine that you probably see a lot of people do quote unquote back extensions on. It's basically a machine that has these two pads that go on the tops of both of your quads. And then it has two pads on your feet which guard your heels. And then you basically are in a prone position, so you're facing the floor, but it's at a 45-degree angle. A lot of people do back extensions, as I said, on them, but that's what a 45-degree hyper is. A GHR is a glute ham raise, and that's effectively a machine which is much higher up, and you put your feet in it, and again, it's something that supports your hips, but this time you're literally parallel to the ground, and it allows you to get 45-degree angle at the hip. So effectively, your legs are, if you look at yourself from side on as a clock face, your feet are at 9 o'clock, your hips are like right in the middle, and it allows you to get your head to 6 o'clock, and then you can work between kind of 3 o'clock and 6 o'clock on that angle, if you like. It's horrible. They are brilliant, but horrible. We did them like near the end of our session. I think it pretty much killed me off. But yeah, they're a really good exercise. A GHR, they're a bit like a Nordic curl, to be honest. Very hard to do, lots of eccentric loading. I don't know many, in fact, I don't actually know anyone who can do a concentric Nordic curl. There are people, if you type into Google NFL Nordic curl, there's some guys in the NFL who can do them, and it is unbelievable. Like they look like they defy the laws of physics, but very, very cool. And so they're two machines that you can use. Not, in fact, unless you're training in a CrossFit gym, it's very unlikely you'll have a GHR or a powerlifting gym. We're very fortunate to have one at our gym, but I don't think you've ever had one in any other gym, have you, Jack?
No, I've not.
But 45-degree hypers are a bit more popular, aren't they? Because people do, as I said, back extensions and stuff. Do you have one of them in your gym?
Yeah. We don't, but yeah, they are more common. And you may also see people, you say back extensions, people also do like 45-degree glute extensions with them as well. That's quite common. That's just where you have like a rounded back and maybe holding a plate on your chest, for example, and really squeezing the glutes into the pad, not coming up all the way. Whereas if you're going to make them more hamstring focused, we're talking about really keeping the legs locked out and straight and focusing on a lot of torso movement, coming down to get a really good stretch at the bottom, trying to pull very intentionally from your hamstrings to bring you back up. And at the bottom, they're really going to feel like they're about to snap. Make sure you warm up well so they don't actually snap. Then bring yourself all the way back up to the top. And lowering down again with control, which is different to the glute variation.
Any final tips on hamstring training, Jack, while we're here?
Mess around with, so we spoke about body position and toe position on the hamstring curls. You can also mess around a little bit with inversion and eversion at the feet. Some people, for example, find that if you are to do something like an RDL and have the toes pointing slightly out, they feel that's better. They feel that's a much more comfortable movement, just giving a little bit of opening at the hips and turning those feet outwards just towards kind of 10 and 2 on a clock. If you're doing something similar on a hamstring curl, what you can actually do is if you turn the feet again outwards, so it's like your outer ankle is kind of in contact with the pad, that is going to hit that kind of outer lateral part of the hamstrings a little bit more. It is going to emphasize that. This is very much advanced stuff, and it's minutia in the sense of that there's going to be very few people who like purposefully need to focus on outer hamstrings compared to inner or something. So I'm only saying this for people who really might want to take it a step deeper and experiment with this sort of thing. And equally, if you are to turn the feet inwards a little bit, there is a part of the hamstrings. I believe it's a part of the semimembranosus, but it may be the semitendinosus. So don't quote me on that one. That is involved in kind of internal rotation at the hip as well. So that's kind of turning that foot inwards. So you can have a little play with that, have a little play with foot positioning and see where you might want to emphasize more or less of, or just where you feel a lot more comfortable with when you are doing those movements. Because if you feel more comfortable and you're able to shift more weight because of that, and keep form good, then that's probably going to be a good thing for hamstring growth.
Wonderful. My final point would be range of motion is really quite important for this. So even if you're doing hamstring curls, take on board what Jack said at the start, use full range of motion, use a good tempo, and you will get far more out of this than if you try and go through these hamstring movements in a far more rushed and maybe less delicate way, because they will work really well for you. It may just be that you need to start and be a bit more patient, use that good tempo, and obviously full range of motion as well. Jack, thank you ever so much, my friend. As always, I'm sure everyone will join me in saying how much we appreciate you coming on. Have a great day, guys. If you have any cues, drop us a DM. And other than that, have a fantastic one. And speak to you soon. Take care all.